There are 840 languages spoken in Papua New Guinea. Not dialects, languages, as different from one another as English is from Mandarin. That number is not a guess. Linguists have catalogued them. Some are spoken by hundreds of thousands, others by fewer than 100 people, in a single village, in a single valley, surrounded by mountains so steep that the next village over, 3 kilometers away, speaks something entirely different. And the land they live on is one of the last places on Earth that remains, in parts, genuinely unmapped. Topographical surveys of New Guinea's interior still carry blank patches labeled incomplete relief data. Not because nobody has tried, because the terrain won't allow it. A spine of mountains runs the length of the island for more than 2,500 kilometers. Peaks rise to nearly 5,000 meters. Below them, valleys fold into valleys, separated by ridges so sharp and jungles so dense that neighboring communities, sometimes only a few kilometers apart, lived for thousands of years with no knowledge of each other's existence. How does a single country produce more languages than any continent on Earth? And what happens to them when the maps finally arrive? The highlands of New Guinea were, until recently, one of the largest populated areas on the planet that outsiders had never seen. Not unpopulated, unseen. The mountains that run through the heart of the island were assumed by the Dutch, the British, the Germans, the Australians, all of whom claimed pieces of the coast, to be a single, uninhabited mountain chain. A wall of rock and cloud separating the northern and southern lowlands, nothing of interest between them. Then, in the early 1930s, the first outsiders walked in. Australian gold prospector Michael Leahy led a series of expeditions into the Central Highlands between 1930 and 1934. He was looking for gold. What he found was something that reordered the colonial imagination. Valley after valley, basin after basin, not empty but full. Terraced gardens, drainage channels, fences, smoke rising from hundreds of settlements. More than 1 million people living in a region the outside world had written off as uninhabitable. Leahy brought a camera. His photographs and film footage captured the astonishment on both sides. Highland people who had never seen pale skin, who touched the visitors' faces trying to understand, and Leahy, who had expected wilderness, staring at an agricultural civilization older than anything in Europe. The encounter was mutual disbelief. For the Highlanders, there was no category for what they were seeing. Some communities believed these visitors were returning spirits of the dead, pale, strange, arriving from a direction no living person had ever come from. Others simply couldn't place them. They didn't fit. Leahy's own journals record moments of mutual incomprehension. He offered steel axes to people who had never seen metal. They took the axes, tested them against stone, and understood immediately. What they could not understand was where these strangers had come from, and why. The Highlanders had names for every valley, every ridge, every stream within their territory. But beyond the mountains that ringed their world, there was nothing. No map, no word, no concept of what lay beyond. One of Leahy's most famous photographs shows a group of highland men staring at the camera, not with fear, not with awe, but with the concentrated attention of people trying to make sense of something their entire framework of knowledge has no space for. It is one of the last genuine first contact images in history. Within a generation, steel tools, Australian patrol officers, and Christian missionaries would reach every major valley. The world the Highlanders knew would never be the same. And for the outsiders, there was no precedent for what they had found. The colonial administration had governed Papua and New Guinea for decades. They had mapped the coasts, established plantations, built airstrips, but they had never looked up. The highlands contained not just people, but organized societies, trade networks that moved shell valuables, salt, stone axes, and bird of paradise plumes across hundreds of kilometers of mountain terrain. Ceremonial exchange cycles, like the tea and mocha systems of the Central and Western Highlands, that organized political alliances and settled disputes without centralized authority. Systems of governance that had been operating for millennia without any contact with the world below. Papua New Guinea's 840 languages didn't develop in spite of the terrain. They developed because of it. The island of New Guinea is the second largest on Earth. Only Greenland is bigger, and Greenland is mostly ice. New Guinea is mostly life. It sits where the Indo-Australian plate collides with the Pacific plate, a tectonic boundary that has crumpled the land into some of the most extreme topography anywhere. The Central Highlands stretch more than 1,600 kilometers east to west. Individual peaks exceed 4,000 meters. The tree line sits at roughly that altitude, and the highest summits once held equatorial glaciers, ice on the equator, retreating now, but present for millennia. Below the peaks, everything drops. Montane cloud forest gives way to lowland rainforest. Limestone karst collapses into sinkholes and jagged ridges. Rivers carve gorges. And on the southern side, the Huli River, one of the largest river systems in the southern hemisphere, spreads across a floodplain so vast it disappears into swamp. Roughly 70% of the country is forested. There are no highways crossing the interior. Most highland towns are accessible only by air. The roads that exist connect fragments, a city here, a mining town there. But the interior remains, as it has for 50,000 years, a place you cross on foot, or not at all. The Huli River alone makes the point. It is one of the largest river systems in the southern hemisphere, draining more than 76,000 square kilometers of lowland forest and swamp. In its lower reaches, the floodplain spreads so wide that the distinction between river and land becomes meaningless. During the wet season, water covers everything. Villages sit on stilts above an inland sea. The Torres Strait, just 150 kilometers wide, separates Papua New Guinea from Australia. During the ice ages, when sea levels dropped, the two land masses were connected, a single continent called Sahul. People walked between them, animals crossed. The fauna of New Guinea still carries the signature of that connection: marsupials, echidnas, and species whose closest relatives are in Queensland. When the seas rose roughly 8,000 years ago, the bridge flooded. Papua New Guinea became an island. and the isolation that would define everything began. But not all isolation is vertical. To the east of the mainland, scattered across hundreds of kilometers of open sea, Papua New Guinea's island territories hold their own separations and their own connections. The Trobriand Islands, a small coral archipelago off the southeastern tip of the mainland, became famous in the early 20th century when Polish anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski lived among the islanders and documented the Kula Ring, a vast ceremonial exchange network spanning dozens of island communities. In the Kula, decorated shell armbands travel clockwise around the ring of islands. Shell necklaces travel counterclockwise. The objects themselves have no practical value. Their value is relational. A necklace that has passed through the hands of a dozen chiefs carries the weight of a dozen relationships. The Kula connected communities separated by open ocean. It required navigation, negotiation, trust. It was, in effect, a language of exchange, a way to maintain connection across water that would otherwise divide. Malinowski's account of the Kula, published in 1922, became one of the founding texts of modern anthropology. It demonstrated that economic exchange is not always about profit. Sometimes it is about the maintenance of social bonds across distances that make those bonds fragile. In Papua New Guinea, every form of connection, a trade route, a Creole language, a ring of shell valuables, exists against the constant pull of isolation. The mountains separate, the ocean separates, and yet people find ways to reach across. It is here, in this collision of geology and biology, that the sheer density of life becomes difficult to comprehend. New Guinea holds the third largest remaining rainforest on the planet, the highest plant biodiversity of any island. More than 730 bird species, 320 of them found nowhere else. Nearly 200 mammal species, many still being described by science. And an insect fauna so vast, perhaps 100,000 to 300,000 species, that no comprehensive catalogue has ever been attempted. The mammal fauna alone defies expectation. Because New Guinea was once part of the Australian landmass, Sahul, its forests are home to marsupials, cuscus, wallabies, possums, bandicoots, alongside the long-beaked echidna, one of only 5 surviving species of egg-laying mammals on Earth. The echidna lives in the mountain forests, nocturnal and elusive, its biology more ancient than the dinosaurs. And there is the New Guinea harpy eagle, the only endemic apex predator in the sky. It hunts tree kangaroos, wallabies, and possums, striking from above the canopy with talons strong enough to crush bone. It is distributed across the island, but sparsely populated everywhere, a predator whose rarity reflects the vastness of the forest it patrols. Along the northern coast, near the town of Madang, the forest meets the reef. Madang's harbour is often described as one of the most beautiful in the Pacific. Volcanic peaks rising behind a lagoon stippled with coral. It was here that some of the earliest natural history collections were made, and here that the transition from terrestrial to marine diversity becomes visible. The same tectonic forces that built the mountains also built the drop-offs, steep underwater walls where deep ocean meets shallow reef, concentrating species into some of the richest marine habitats in the world. But among all the life forms that New Guinea has produced, none captures the island's essence, quite like the bird that gave the land its shape. The outline of New Guinea is often compared to a bird of paradise in flight. The western peninsula is the head, the eastern tail trails behind, and across the island, more than 40 species of birds of paradise live in the canopy, each one an argument for what isolation can create. The Rajiana bird of paradise is Papua New Guinea's national bird. The males are rust orange and deep crimson, with long cascading flank plumes that they raise into a shimmering fan during courtship. The display is not subtle. Males gather in the upper branches of canopy trees, sometimes 5 or 6 at once, and hang upside down, spreading their plumes into trembling curtains of color. They call, they flutter, they wait. The females watch from nearby branches, evaluating. This ritual has been repeating for millions of years. It is among the most elaborate courtship displays in the animal kingdom, and it has shaped not just the birds, but the people who share the forest with them. The Huli Wigmen of the Western Highlands model their ceremonial headdresses after these birds. Young men spend months in the forest growing their hair, which is then woven into elaborate wigs decorated with feathers, flowers, and pigments. The connection is explicit. To the Huli, the birds are not decoration. They are templates. More than 40 species, some with iridescent blue breast shields, some with wire-like tail feathers that extend a meter behind them, some with courtship dances that involve clearing a stage on the forest floor and performing for hours. Each species is a product of isolation. Each valley, each altitude, each ridge created a pocket where a population was cut off long enough to evolve its own form, its own display, its own song. The same mechanism that created 40 species of birds of paradise created 840 human languages. Port Moresby sits on the southeastern coast, squeezed between the sea and the foothills. It is the capital, home to several 100,000 people, and in many ways, a different country from the highlands that stretch behind it. The city runs on generators and diesel. It has shopping malls, a parliament building, churches. Papua New Guinea adopted Christianity as its official state religion in 2025, and a crime rate that keeps most residents behind barbed wire after dark. It is one of the most dangerous capitals in the Pacific and one of the least visited. But Port Moresby is also where the country's contradictions become visible. The Constitution of Papua New Guinea explicitly protects traditional communities and lifestyles. It enshrines diversity. It acknowledges that the nation it governs was, until very recently, thousands of separate nations, and that forcing them into one was a colonial invention. The country has 3 official languages: English, Tok Pisin, and Hiri Motu. But English is a language of government and education. Hiri Motu is regional, spoken mainly on the southern coast. The real lingua franca is Tok Pisin, a Creole that developed on German and Australian plantations in the late 19th century, where workers from dozens of different language groups needed a way to communicate. Tok Pisin is everywhere now. It is the sound of the markets, the news broadcasts, the political speeches. And for many younger Papua New Guineans, it is replacing the language their grandparents spoke. To understand what Papua New Guinea is and what it stands to lose, you have to leave the capital. You have to go north, into the interior, to the river that has been called the soul of the country. The Sepik River winds through the swampy rainforests of the northwest for more than 1,100 kilometers. It has no delta in the traditional sense. The water simply spreads, merging with swamp and lagoon until the distinction between river and land dissolves. In the wet season, the floodplain extends for kilometers on either side. In places, the river is so wide and slow it resembles a lake. Along its banks and tributaries, more than 200 languages are spoken. Each bend, each village, each tributary has produced its own cultural tradition. But they share something, a relationship with the river that has shaped their art, their architecture, and their understanding of who they are. At the center of almost every Sepik village stands a house tambaran, a spirit house. These are not small structures. The ceremonial houses of the Iatmul people, the dominant culture of the Middle Sepik, are long rectangular buildings elevated on carved posts with steeply pitched roofs that tower above every other structure in the village. The gables carry masks, carved in wood or woven from cane, depicting ancestral spirits and founding figures. Inside, the walls hold centuries of accumulated sacred objects, carved figures representing named spirit beings, slit gongs, garamut, hollowed from single tree trunks and carved into the shapes of totemic animals, flutes whose sounds are believed to be the voices of spirits, masks that are never worn on faces but kept as sacred images. The garamut drums are more than instruments. They are communication systems. Different rhythmic patterns carry specific messages, announcements of death, calls to assembly, warnings of approaching strangers. Before radio, before roads, the garamut carried meaning across distances that voices could not reach. The sound travels for kilometers along the river, absorbed and reflected by the water, arriving at the next village as information coded in rhythm. And the mythology that fills the spirit houses is not abstract. It is specific, named, and territorial. Among the Iatmul, for example, the origin story of the Yipwan, hook-shaped spirit figures found along the Korewari River, tells of the sun spirit carving the first slit gong. The wood chips came to life as spirits who lived in the ceremonial house. One day, these spirits killed one of the sun's relatives and drank his blood. The sun, in fury, ascended into the sky. The Yipwan remained on earth as patron spirits of warfare and hunting. These figures are not art in the Western sense. They are inhabited. They hold power. Some are so old, Korewari cave figures abandoned for hundreds of years, that only roughly 250 survive. Women are forbidden from entering. The house tambaran is the center of male ritual life, a place for debate, for ceremony, for the initiation rites that transform boys into men. The Sepik carvers valued visual precision above all. They aspired to the complexity of a spider's web, meticulous, symmetrical, layered. Every curve and hook carried meaning. Every face represented a named ancestor. And this tradition is not dead. The Sepik remains the most prolific art-producing region in Papua New Guinea. Carvers still work in Quila and Garamut wood. Spirit houses are still built, still maintained, still central to village life. But the House Tambaran is more than a building. It is a library without books. Everything that a clan knows about its history, its territory, its relationships with other clans, all of it is stored in the carvings, the songs, the rituals performed inside those walls. When a spirit house falls and no one rebuilds it, the library burns. Among the Sepik's most distinctive traditions is one that marks the body itself as a text. In parts of the river system, particularly among the Kaningara and other communities near Kanganaman, young men undergo a scarification ritual tied to the crocodile, the river's most powerful presence. Cuts are made across the chest, the shoulders, the back. Hundreds of incisions, raised into permanent welts by packing the wounds with clay and ash. The pattern, when healed, resembles the ridged skin of a crocodile. The ritual is not cosmetic, it is transformation. The belief is that the crocodile spirit consumes the boy's body and remakes it. What emerges, scarred, raised, patterned, is a man who carries the crocodile within him. It is one of the most painful rites of passage practiced anywhere in the world. And it continues today. Every year, in the town of Ambunti, a festival celebrates the tradition through dance, music, and displays of scarification, a public declaration that the old ways have not been swallowed by the new. Further south, in the highlands of Hela province, the landscape changes. The swamps give way to mountain valleys, the air cools, and the cultural expression shifts from carving and scarification to hair. The Huli are one of the largest tribal groups in Papua New Guinea, roughly 250,000 people, and their men are among the most visually striking figures in the Pacific. Young Huli men are sent into the forest for months at a time. Their task is to grow their hair. When it reaches the required length, it is carefully shaped, dried, and woven into a wig, often decorated with bird of paradise feathers, flowers, couscous fur, and vivid pigments made from ochre and clay. The wigs are modeled directly on the plumage of the birds of paradise that live in the surrounding forest. The connection between bird and human display is not metaphorical. It is intentional, deliberate. A man who wears a wig modeled on the Rajiana is claiming something about beauty, about status, about readiness. The tradition survives, not as a performance for tourists, but as a living practice with ceremonial weight. Huli gatherings, particularly the Sing Sings, multi-village festivals of dance and display, bring together hundreds of men in full regalia. The wigs alone can take years to prepare. The Sing Sings are not only Huli. Across the highlands, dozens of language groups gather at these festivals, each bringing their own costumes, their own dances, their own music. The Mount Hagen Cultural Show, held annually in the Western Highlands since 1964, draws thousands of performers from across the country. A man from the Chimbu province paints his face with white clay and bones. A group from the Simbu wears skeleton body paint. The skeleton dancers, turning themselves into walking images of the dead to ward off enemies and disease. Each group's display is a statement of identity. This is who we are. This is where we come from. This is what our mountain taught us. And beneath the spectacle is something older. The Sing Sings are also sites of diplomacy. Alliances are formed, Disputes are negotiated. Marriages are arranged. The festivals are, in effect, the closest thing the highlands have to a parliament, a place where communities that cannot understand each other's languages communicate through performance. East of the Huli homeland, in the eastern highlands near the town of Goroka, another tradition carries a different kind of memory. The Asaro mudmen, also known as the Holosa, wear masks of baked mud with exaggerated features. Pointed ears, drooping tongues, pig bones piercing the nose. Their bodies are coated in pale clay that dries and lightens in the sun, giving them the appearance of ghosts. The origin story is specific. During a war with a neighboring tribe, the Asaro were pushed back into a muddy riverbank. Retreating, they were covered in pale sediment. When they emerged, their enemies, seeing pale, ghostly figures rising from the earth, fled in terror. The Asaro never forgot. They turned a moment of desperation into an identity. The mud masks became a ritual. The retreat became a mythology. It is a story about survival, about taking the thing that nearly destroyed you and wearing it as armor. But the forests of Papua New Guinea belong to more than the people who walk through them. In the lowland rainforests, dense, wet, dim even at midday, something moves through the undergrowth with the weight of a small horse and the temperament of a creature that remembers being larger. The southern cassowary stands nearly 2 meters tall. It is flightless. It weighs up to 60 kilograms. Its head is crowned with a bony casque, a helmet of keratin, and its neck is a vivid slash of blue and red against the dark forest. Its inner toe carries a claw more than 12 centimeters long, capable of disemboweling a dog. But the cassowary's power is not in its weaponry. It is in its role. More than 150 species of rainforest trees depend on the cassowary for seed dispersal. The bird eats fruit whole, large fruit that no other animal can swallow, and carries the seeds through its gut for kilometers before depositing them intact on the forest floor. Without cassowaries, those trees cannot reproduce. Without those trees, the forest changes. The cassowary is not a part of the ecosystem. It is the mechanism by which the ecosystem perpetuates itself. 3 species of cassowary are native to New Guinea. 2 of them, the southern and the northern, reach 1.8 meters in height. The third, the dwarf cassowary, is the largest native vertebrate in the mountain forests, communicating with other cassowaries through a low, booming sound that travels through dense undergrowth, like something felt rather than heard. For tens of millions of years, these birds have walked the forests of New Guinea. They predate the arrival of humans by an immense margin. And yet, they have survived. Survived the ice ages, survived the arrival of agriculture, survived the introduction of dogs and pigs. Because the forest they sustain sustains them in return. South of the Sepik, inland from the coasts, the landscape rises, the air changes, the humidity drops, and at 1,500 meters above sea level, in the western highlands near the town of Mount Hagen, the terrain opens into a series of broad valleys, green, terraced, cultivated. It was here, in the Upper Wagi Valley, that one of the most consequential archaeological discoveries of the 20th century was made. Not in Egypt, not in Mesopotamia, in Papua New Guinea. The site is called Cook's Swamp. It covers 116 hectares of wetland, and it has been farmed continuously for at least 7,000 years, possibly 10,000. That number places Cook Swamp alongside the Fertile Crescent and the Yangtze River Valley as one of the very few places on Earth where agriculture was invented independently. Not learned from neighbors, not imported along trade routes, invented from scratch by people who looked at the swamp around them and decided to reshape it. The trigger was probably climatic. At the end of the last ice age, as temperatures rose and the Holocene began, the rainforests crept up the mountainsides. The open meadows that highland foragers had relied on, rich in diverse food plants, were swallowed by closed canopy. People could climb higher to continue their old way of life, or they could stay and try something new. At Cook Swamp, in the Upper Wagi Valley, they stayed. The evidence is in the ground. Drainage ditches, dug by hand with wooden tools, channeling water away from planting mounds. The earliest phase, dated to roughly 10,000 years ago, shows small channels and post holes, signs of deliberate planting and staking. By 7,000 years ago, organized mounded cultivation was underway. Taro on the edges of the mounds where it could tolerate the water. Bananas and sugarcane at the centers where the soil was drier. It was a system designed around the swamp, not fighting the water, but managing it. Low spaces between the mounds served as drainage channels. Higher spots stayed dry enough for upland crops. The entire landscape was reshaped into an artificial environment capable of sustaining a permanent population. Australian archaeologist Jack Golson arrived at Cook in the 1960s when the Australian administration established a research station nearby. He spent the next 30 years excavating. What he found rewrote the history of agriculture. Golson and his colleagues uncovered layer after layer of cultivation: wooden digging sticks, stone axes, grindstones, drainage channels of increasing sophistication. Each phase showed adaptation. Each phase showed people solving problems. When the swamp flooded, they dug bigger ditches. When the forest crept back, they burned it. When the soil changed, they changed with it. By 4,000 years ago, the Cook farmers had built major disposal channels, engineered waterways that diverted entire streams away from the cultivation area, feeding them into new paths to the northeast. These were not ditches, they were infrastructure. And yet, for millennia, the outside world knew nothing. The highlands were assumed to be empty. The people who had been farming since before Stonehenge was conceived were invisible. In 2008, UNESCO inscribed Cook Swamp as a World Heritage Site, the only one in Papua New Guinea. Its significance is not its age alone, but what it proves: that agriculture arose here
independently,
that the people of the highlands were not waiting to be discovered. They had already built something, quietly, persistently, without an audience. At lower elevations, in the coastal rainforests of Oro Province on the northeastern coast, the canopy holds something found nowhere else on Earth. The Queen Alexandra's birdwing is the largest butterfly in the world. Its wingspan reaches 31 centimeters. The females are larger, brown and white, subtle. The males are smaller but vivid, deep blue-green wings crossed with bands of black and yellow. They live in a narrow strip of lowland rainforest. Their caterpillars feed on a single genus of toxic vine, Aristolochia, absorbing the plant's poisons and carrying them into adulthood, making the butterflies unpalatable to predators. The species was first described in 1907, when a specimen was collected with a shotgun, the only way early naturalists could bring one down from the canopy. Today, the Queen Alexandra's birdwing is critically endangered. Its habitat has been reduced by logging, oil palm plantations, and the eruption of Mount Lamington in 1951, which destroyed a significant portion of its range. The butterfly's entire world is a patch of forest, roughly 100 square kilometers in size. The largest butterfly on Earth, reduced to a postage stamp of habitat. One of the world's rarest insects in one of the world's least explored countries. It persists, but narrowly and without much margin. If the mountains created isolation on land, the sea tells a different story. Papua New Guinea sits at the western edge of the Coral Triangle, the most biodiverse marine region on the planet. The waters off Milne Bay and Kimby Bay hold more than 900 species of reef fish, more than 500 species of hard coral. Seagrass beds stretch along the coast, and mangrove systems weave through the estuaries where fresh water meets salt. The reefs here are older and more complex than almost anywhere in the Indo-Pacific. Kimby Bay alone, a single bay on the northern coast of New Britain, contains roughly 60% of all the coral species found in the entire Indo-Pacific region. The contrast is striking. On land, Papua New Guinea's story is one of separation. Mountains divide, ridges isolate, languages fracture. But in the ocean, the currents connect. Larvae drift, populations mix. The Coral Triangle is a meeting place, a region where ocean systems overlap and diversity accumulates. On land, isolation created 840 languages. In the sea, connection created 900 species of fish. The same country, two opposite mechanisms, both producing the same result: density of life that overwhelms the imagination. To the northeast, the island of New Britain adds another layer. It is crescent-shaped, 520 kilometers long, and split between rainforest, rugged mountains, and active volcanoes. The town of Rabaul sits at the edge of a collapsed volcanic caldera overlooking Simpson Harbor. In 1994, twin eruptions of Tavuvur and Vulcan buried the town under meters of ash. The old airport disappeared. The town center was abandoned. A new town, Kokopo, was built 20 kilometers away. But Rabaul's history runs deeper than volcanoes. In January 1942, the Japanese captured the town and made it their largest air and naval base in the Southwest Pacific. From Rabaul, they launched the campaigns that would sweep across New Guinea, the Solomons, and toward Australia. Allied bombers struck it hundreds of times. Today, the remains of Japanese tunnels, bunkers, and barges still litter the harbor and hillsides, slowly being consumed by the forest. New Britain's wildlife tells its own story of separation. The island holds species found nowhere on the mainland: the blue-eyed cockatoo, the Bismarck pitter, and a recently discovered golden-masked owl. Each one a product of the same isolation that created the mainland's diversity, but operating across water rather than mountains. But there are other kinds of connections that have been forced through Papua New Guinea's mountains, not by currents, by war. In 1942, the world arrived on these shores whether they were invited or not. July 21st, 1942. Japanese forces land on the northern coast at Gona and Buna. Their objective is Port Moresby, the only Allied base in Papua, less than 100 kilometers to the south. To reach it, they must cross the Owen Stanley Range on foot, along a single-file trail that climbs to nearly 2,500 meters through some of the most punishing terrain on the planet. The trail is called the Kokoda Track. It runs 96 kilometers. In 1942, it was not measured in distance, it was measured in days. Opposing the Japanese advance is a force so small it barely registers. 4 platoons of the Australian 39th Battalion and elements of the Papuan Infantry Battalion. Together, they number a few hundred men. The Japanese bring thousands. What follows is 4 months of fighting in conditions that defy comprehension. The track is steep, narrow, and in constant rain, it turns to mud so deep that men sink to their knees. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical ulcers strike both sides. Soldiers on both sides starve. The jungle swallows everything: men, supplies, the dead. The Australians fight a retreating action. Village by village, ridge by ridge, they are pushed back. Kokoda, Isarava, Eora Creek, Templeton's Crossing, until by September, the Japanese reach Ioribaiwa Ridge, less than 50 kilometers from Port Moresby. And then they stop. Overstretched, starving, their supply lines impossible to maintain, and with their forces now needed at Guadalcanal, the Japanese are ordered to withdraw. The Australians push forward. By November, they retake Kokoda. Approximately 625 Australians died along the track. More than 1,600 were wounded. Over 4,000 fell to disease. More than 150 Papuans, soldiers and porters, were killed. Japanese losses exceeded 5,000 from combat, disease, and starvation. Australian soldiers who retraced the route found evidence that some Japanese troops in the final weeks had been reduced to eating grass, roots, and wood. The Papuan men who carried supplies, evacuated wounded, and guided Australian soldiers through the mountains became known as the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, a name that carried both affection and the paternalism of the era. They were not soldiers, they were not paid fairly, but without them, the campaign would have been impossible. They knew the terrain, they knew the trails, they carried men twice their weight on stretchers improvised from branches and vine, climbing through mud and rain in bare feet, while the soldiers they carried wore boots that fell apart. Lieutenant General Tsutomu Yoshihara, Chief of Staff of Japan's South Seas Army, later said of the Australians, their qualities of adaptability and individual initiative made them superb jungle fighters. He did not mention the Papuans. Almost no one did, until decades later. Today, the Kokoda Track is walked by thousands of Australians each year, a pilgrimage of sorts. The trail passes through the land of the mountain Koyari people. There are still no shops, no electricity, no infrastructure along its length. The terrain is exactly as brutal as it was in 1942. Local communities have occasionally closed the track over disputes about trekking fees, money collected from tourists that rarely reaches the villages whose land the trail crosses. Brendan Buka, a trekking porter from Kokoda village, ran the 96 kilometers in 16 hours and 34 minutes in 2008. The record still stands. The descendants of the people who carried the wounded now carry the tourists, across the same ridges, through the same mud, along the same track that their grandparents walked when the world came looking for a fight. But the violence that marked Papua New Guinea's modern history did not end with the war. In 1884, 3 European powers divided the island among themselves. The Dutch took the western half, the Germans took the northeast, and the British took the southeast. No one consulted the people living there. Communities that had been at war with each other for generations were placed inside the same colonial borders. Communities that had never met were declared fellow citizens. After World War I, Australia took control of the former German territory. After World War II, it administered both territories together as the territory of Papua and New Guinea. In 1975, the country became independent. Independence brought its own fractures. The nation that emerged was less a country than a collection of thousands of micronations, each with its own language, its own land, its own sense of who belonged and who didn't. And on Bougainville, a large island to the east, geographically and culturally closer to the Solomon Islands than to mainland Papua New Guinea, the fracture became a war. Bougainville is named after the French navigator who sailed past it in 1768. Its people have darker skin than most mainland Papua New Guineans, a visible marker of their closer connection to the Western Solomons. The island was incorporated into German New Guinea, then Australian New Guinea, then Papua New Guinea. None of these transitions reflecting the wishes of the people who lived there. In 1964, mining exploration by Rio Tinto began in the mountains above the Java River. By 1972, the Panguna copper mine was operational, one of the largest open-pit mines in the world. The pit was more than a kilometer wide. Tailings, millions of tons of waste rock and contaminated sediment, were dumped directly into the Jaba and Kawarong rivers. It generated revenue that accounted for more than 40% of Papua New Guinea's export earnings. The island received a fraction of that revenue. The rivers turned blue with copper residue. Fish died. Gardens downstream were poisoned. It also poisoned the rivers, destroyed forests, displaced communities, and funneled almost none of its profits to the people whose land it consumed. In 1988, local landowner Francis Ona and a group of militants sabotaged the mine, destroying the power supply. The Papua New Guinea government responded with military force. What followed was a civil war that lasted a decade. The military blockaded the island. Medicine, food, fuel cut off. An estimated 15,000 to 20,000 people died, most of them not from combat, but from the blockade itself. Children died of treatable diseases. Mothers died in childbirth without medical supplies. Women fashioned coconut oil into fuel for kerosene lamps. Traditional medicine replaced the pharmacies. It was one of the least reported conflicts of the late 20th century. In 2019, Bougainville held an independence referendum. More than 97% voted to separate from Papua New Guinea. As of now, the terms of that separation are still being negotiated. The Panguna mine remains closed. The rivers are still polluted. The dead are still dead. And the violence in Papua New Guinea is not only historical. Gender violence is endemic. It is not confined to remote areas or traditional communities. It is pervasive, systemic, and deeply embedded. Women are broadly treated as inferiors. Bride price, a negotiated payment from a groom's family to a bride's, remains standard in many communities. Reports of domestic violence, sexual assault, and so-called sorcery-related killings are routine. The Constitution protects traditional culture, but tradition, here as everywhere, contains both beauty and brutality. To speak honestly about Papua New Guinea requires holding both. High in the cloud forests of the Huli Peninsula on the northeastern coast, something climbs through the canopy that should not be there. A kangaroo in a tree. The Machi's tree kangaroo is a marsupial the size of a small dog. Rust-brown fur, a pale belly, a long, heavy tail that lives almost entirely in the upper canopy of montane rainforest. Its forelimbs are thick and muscular, built for gripping branches. Its feet are broad, with rough pads that grip bark. It climbs the way its ground-dwelling relatives hop, with a kind of measured, deliberate momentum. It is the only kangaroo in the world adapted to life in the trees, and it is found only here, on this one peninsula, in this one country, in these specific forests between 1,000 and 3,000 meters elevation. Fewer than 2,500 remain. The species feeds on leaves, fruits, and flowers in the canopy. It is shy, nocturnal, almost impossible to study in the wild. Researchers estimate their lifespan at 15 to 20 years, but even that is uncertain because so few have been observed over time. On the Huli Peninsula, the Tree Kangaroo Conservation Program, a partnership between local communities and international scientists, has established a community-managed conservation area. The approach is not top-down. It is built on relationships with the landowners whose forests the kangaroos inhabit. The people who have always lived alongside these animals are the ones protecting them. The tree kangaroo embodies the paradox of Papua New Guinea. It exists because isolation created the conditions for it. It survives because the people who share its forest have chosen to let it. It is a kangaroo in a tree, a creature that sounds impossible until you see the forest that made it necessary. To understand how isolation works in Papua New Guinea, how it shapes species, how it shapes language, how it shapes everything, you need to see the terrain from above. Mount Wilhelm is the highest point in the country. It rises to 4,509 meters in the Bismarck Range, southeast of the town of Mount Hagen. A climb from its base to its summit passes through every major ecosystem in Papua New Guinea: tropical lowland rainforest, montane forest, subalpine grassland, and finally, above the tree line, bare rock and tussock under a sky that feels closer than it should. The view from the summit, on the rare, clear morning, reveals the architecture of separation. Ridge after ridge, valley after valley, stretching in every direction. Green, folded, vertical. Each valley a world, each ridge a border. No roads visible, no cities, just topography so extreme it looks like the earth was crumpled by hand and never smoothed. This is what created the 840 languages. Not time alone, not distance alone, terrain. Linguists call it a punctuated landscape, a surface broken into so many isolated pockets that populations living in neighboring valleys can diverge independently, developing separate vocabularies, grammars, phonologies, and eventually, over centuries, over millennia, entirely separate languages. The same process that produces new species in isolated habitats produces new languages in isolated communities. And the man who first articulated that mechanism, who turned the observation into a theory, learned it here. In 1928, a young German biologist named Ernst Mayr arrived in New Guinea on an expedition for the American Museum of Natural History and the naturalist banker Walter Rothschild. He was 22 years old. His job was to collect bird skins. He collected thousands. He named 26 new bird species during his lifetime. He explored the mountain forests of the Huon Peninsula and the highlands, cataloging not just what he found, but where he found it, which species lived on which ridge, which populations were separated by which valleys. What Mayr observed in New Guinea's birds changed the course of biology. He saw that populations separated by ridges or rivers, even over relatively short distances, developed distinct traits. Different plumage, different calls. Over enough time, they became different species entirely. He called this process allopatric speciation, the formation of new species through geographic isolation. It became one of the foundational concepts in evolutionary biology, and it explained, in a single mechanism, why New Guinea, with its fractured, vertical, impossible terrain, had produced more species per square kilometer than almost anywhere on Earth. Mayr also solved a puzzle that had baffled ornithologists for decades. He determined that several of New Guinea's rarest birds of paradise, unique specimens that appeared in museum collections, were not species at all. They were hybrids, crosses between species that met in narrow overlap zones where one ridge's population encountered another's. The rarest birds were not the most isolated. They were the ones where isolation briefly broke down. The same principle applies to languages. Where ridges separated populations completely, new languages formed. Where trade routes, rivers, or marriages connected them, pidgins and creoles emerged, shared codes for crossing boundaries. Tok Pisin is not a failure. It is a hybrid, a linguistic bird of paradise, born where isolation met connection. But Tok Pisin's spread carries a shadow. Of Papua New Guinea's 840 catalogued languages, a significant number are spoken by fewer than 1,000 people. Some by fewer than 100. A few by a single generation of elders in a single village. When a language dies, what is lost is not just words. It is a system of knowledge, a way of classifying the world. Plants, animals, relationships, weather patterns, spiritual forces that exists in no other language. Languages encode how their speakers think. The Yupno people of the Finisterre Range, for example, orients spatial descriptions not by left and right, but by uphill and downhill, a system shaped directly by the steep terrain they live in. Their concept of time flows uphill. The past is downslope. The future is above. Other languages in Papua New Guinea have entirely different counting systems, some based on body parts rather than abstract numbers, counting from the thumb up one arm, across the shoulders, and down the other. The numbers themselves follow the body's geography. No dictionary can capture that. No translation preserves the cognitive architecture that a language builds. When the last speaker of a language dies, the structure they carried, the particular way their community divided the world into categories, disappears entirely. In the southern highlands, Lake Kutubu lies at 800 meters elevation in a limestone basin, a deep, still body of water sacred to the Foi people who live on its shores. The Foi have their own language, their own poetry tradition, a form of ceremonial song called Sora Habora that narrates the landscape itself, naming every hill, creek, and stand of trees in the singer's territory. The songs are maps. They are property titles. They are histories. If the Foi language disappears, those songs become sounds without meaning. The landscape loses its names. The hills become anonymous. And the pace of loss is accelerating. Roads bring Tok Pisin. Schools teach in English. Television and mobile phones carry languages from outside. Young people in many highland communities now speak Tok Pisin as their first language, learning their parents' tongue, if they learn it at all, as a second language, incompletely, without the ceremonial and spiritual vocabulary that gives it depth. Papua New Guinea's 840 languages represent roughly 12% of all languages spoken on Earth. In a single country, on a single island, and its surrounding archipelagos. The Sepik River Basin alone, the river system and its tributaries, contains at least a dozen separate language families. Not languages, families. Groups of languages as different from each other as the Romance languages are from Mandarin. On the island of New Britain, to the northeast, language isolates exist, languages with no known relatives anywhere, as if they emerged from nothing and connected to nothing. The diversity is not random. It follows the terrain with almost mathematical precision. Where valleys are deep and ridges are high, languages proliferate. Where rivers connect, they merge. Where coasts open, they spread. The Trans-New Guinea language family, the largest on the island, contains roughly half of all Papua New Guinean languages. Linguists believe it began to diversify around 10,000 years ago. At roughly the same time, the highland populations adopted agriculture at Cook Swamp. The genetic evidence aligns. When people settled into valleys and began farming, they stopped moving. And when they stopped moving, their languages started splitting. The remaining half of Papua New Guinea's languages belong to dozens of smaller families: Sepik, Torricelli, Lower Sepik Ramu, Left May, as well as Austronesian languages along the coast, brought by seafaring peoples from the north roughly 3,500 years ago. These Austronesian speakers colonized the offshore islands and coastal fringes, introducing pigs, new crops, and the Lapita pottery tradition that would eventually spread across the Pacific to Polynesia. The result is a linguistic landscape so dense that a journey of 50 kilometers through the highlands can cross 4 or 5 completely unrelated languages, not dialects. Languages with different vocabularies, different grammars, different ways of constructing meaning. The map of languages in Papua New Guinea is, in effect, a map of its mountains. There is a phrase used by the diverse communities of Papua New Guinea to describe their own condition. The saying goes, "For each village, a different culture." It is not a complaint, it is a statement of fact, and in many communities, it carries something close to pride. My language is mine, my village is mine, my mountain is mine. The linguistic diversity of Papua New Guinea is not a problem to be solved. It is not a failure to consolidate. It is the natural consequence of 50,000 years of human habitation in terrains so fractured that every valley became a laboratory of culture. But the forces that preserved that diversity, the mountains, the forests, the absence of roads, are changing. Logging roads penetrate the lowlands. Mining operations open the highlands. Mobile phones reach villages that have no electricity. And Tok Pisin, the Creole that was born on colonial plantations, is becoming the first language of a generation that may be the last to hear their grandparents' tongue. The outside world arrives not with armies now, but with cell towers and chainsaws. The result, for the languages, may be the same. In 1884, 3 European empires looked at this island and saw territory. They drew lines on maps. The lines had nothing to do with the people who lived inside them. In the 1930s, gold prospectors walked into the highlands and saw 1 million people no one knew existed. They took photographs, they told stories, they left. In 1942, armies from both sides of a global war fought across these mountains, died in the mud of these valleys, and then, when the war ended, left. In 1975, a country was declared, stitched together from thousands of communities that had never asked to be one nation. And through all of it, the mapmakers, the prospectors, the soldiers, the colonial administrators, the missionaries, the mining companies, the people of Papua New Guinea continued to farm the valleys they had farmed for 10,000 years, continued to carve the spirits their ancestors carved, continued to speak the languages their mountains had given them. So what does it mean to map a place? The cartographers came, they surveyed the coasts, they drew the borders, they named the mountains after German governors and British queens. They marked the rivers and measured the reefs. But the maps still have blank spaces, incomplete relief data, patches of white where the terrain refused to cooperate. And in those patches, people live, they farm, they speak languages that exist nowhere else. They carve spirits into wood and paint them in ochre and white clay. Mapping a place means claiming to know it, and the story of Papua New Guinea is a story about the limits of that claim. The highland valleys didn't need to be discovered. They were never lost. The languages didn't need to be catalogued to exist. They had been spoken for millennia before the first linguist arrived. 840 languages, more than any other country on Earth. Not because Papua New Guinea failed to unify, but because the mountains were too steep, the valleys too deep, and the people too persistent to let the landscape flatten them into one. Each language is a world. Each valley is a laboratory. Each community that still speaks its own tongue is proof that isolation does not impoverish, it creates. And every language that falls silent is a laboratory that closes, with no record of what it found. In the remote mountains of Papua New Guinea, above the level where humans build villages, a sound rises at dusk that has been described as unlike anything else in the animal kingdom. The New Guinea singing dog is a wild canid that arrived on the island at least 6,000 years ago. It is closely related to the Australian dingo, but it is not a dingo. It lives in the high-altitude forests and alpine grasslands, elevations where the air thins and the temperature drops below what most tropical animals can tolerate. It is rarely seen. Most evidence of its existence comes from recordings. The singing dog does not bark. It howls, a rising, modulating call that shifts in pitch and tone. When multiple dogs howl together, they harmonize. They do not howl in unison. Each dog takes a different note, a different register, and the calls weave together into something that researchers have compared to a chord, or a phrase, or a song. It is the largest terrestrial predator remaining on the island of New Guinea, not the cassowary, which is a frugivore that hunts opportunistically, not the crocodile monitor, which hunts in the lowlands, the singing dog, in the mountains, alone. 6,000 years on this island, living above the villages, singing into valleys where 840 languages are spoken below. If isolation creates diversity, the singing dog is its voice, rising at dusk from a ridgeline no one has mapped, harmonizing with others it cannot see. Perhaps what we call unmapped says more about the mapmaker than the land. The mountains of Papua New Guinea have been walked for 50,000 years. Every ridge has a name in someone's language. Every valley has a history stored in a house tambourine, or a grandmother's memory, or the pattern of scars on a young man's chest. The maps are not blank. They are written in 840 languages that the cartographers could not read. And the question that hangs over this place, the question that every logging road and cell tower and mining concession makes more urgent, is not whether Papua New Guinea can be mapped. It is what happens to the knowledge that the maps cannot hold. The drainage channels at Cook Swamp are 10,000 years old. The spirit houses on the Sepik are rebuilt every generation. The Huli still grow their wigs. The Asaro still wear their mud. The cassowary still carries seeds through forests that cannot reproduce without it. And somewhere in the highlands, at dusk, a dog that is not quite a dog sings into a valley that has never been surveyed. Papua New Guinea is not the last place on Earth nobody has mapped. It is the last place on Earth that reminds us that mapping is not the same as knowing. Thanks for watching. If journeys like this one speak to you, subscribe to Where on Earth. We'll see you on the next one.